The Vietnam War was a conflict shrouded in ambiguity, fought not just in jungles and rice paddies, but in the hearts and minds of millions. It was a war of bravery and tragedy, where noble intentions collided with harsh realities. The conflict forced America to question its identity, power, and purpose. More than a Cold War episode, it was the climax of Vietnam's long struggle for independence, a civil, revolutionary, and proxy war all at once. Soldiers faced an invisible enemy in a beautiful yet deadly landscape, relying on helicopters and bombers, yet often reduced to primitive survival. The war's brutal intimacy and technological distance created a disorienting experience, impossible to fully convey to those back home. Ultimately, Vietnam became a crucible for both nations, leaving scars and questions that still echo today. Before Americans arrived, Vietnam had endured nearly a century of French colonial rule. The French imposed their language, laws, and economy, stripping resources and crushing Vietnamese aspirations. This oppression forged a fierce nationalism, fueling decades of resistance. Ho Chi Minh, inspired by communism and American ideals, led the Viet Minh in a fight for independence. After World War II, the First Indochina War erupted, an 8-year guerrilla struggle against the French. The Viet Minh, supported by the rural population, used ambushes and tunnels to wear down the French. The decisive moment came at Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh's siege forced a French surrender. The defeat shattered French colonial ambitions and signaled that determined nationalist movements could topple Western powers. Vietnam's fight for self-determination was far from over. The French defeat led to the Geneva Accords, temporarily dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's communists controlled the north. A Western-backed government ruled the south. Nationwide elections to reunify the country were promised but never held, as the U.S. feared a communist victory. The U.S. propped up Ngo Dinh Diem in the south, whose corrupt, repressive rule fueled discontent. In response, the Viet Cong emerged, launching a guerrilla campaign to reunite Vietnam by force. The 17th parallel became a bitter divide, separating families and turning reconciliation into civil war. The conflict was now fueled by Cold War superpowers, transforming Vietnam into a battleground for global ideologies. What began as a temporary solution became a permanent scar. U.S. involvement in Vietnam began cautiously, with military advisors and economic aid sent to support the fledgling South Vietnamese government. The goal was to build a stable anti-communist state in the South, one that could resist the growing influence of the Communist North and the Viet Cong insurgency. American officials believed that with enough support South Vietnam could stand on its own. But the South's army struggled with deep-rooted corruption and low morale. Many soldiers were poorly trained and leadership was often ineffective. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, fighting in the dense jungles, gained ground and support among rural populations, making the conflict increasingly difficult for the South. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, its details still debated today, gave President Lyndon Johnson sweeping authority to escalate U.S. involvement. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, effectively handing Johnson a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang, marking a dramatic shift from advisory roles to direct military intervention. The American presence in Vietnam would only grow from here. Troop numbers soared into the hundreds of thousands. The U.S. adopted a strategy of attrition, aiming to kill more enemy soldiers than could be replaced, believing this would eventually force the communists to negotiate. Massive bombing campaigns, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, unleashed unprecedented firepower on North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The hope was to break the enemy's will and disrupt their supply lines, but the results were far from decisive. The war had no clear front lines, just dense jungles, shifting battlefields, and a grim body count. Objectives were elusive, and victories on paper rarely translated to real progress on the ground. American soldiers faced a hidden enemy, often indistinguishable from civilians. The Viet Cong blended seamlessly with villagers, making every patrol fraught with uncertainty and danger. The quick victory that U.S. leaders had hoped for never materialized. Instead, America found itself drawn deeper into a costly and controversial conflict it could neither win outright nor easily abandon. Vietnam became America's quagmire, a war with no clear end in sight. For American soldiers, Vietnam was a nightmare of fear and confusion. Each day brought new dangers, and the sense of uncertainty was constant. The dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain made even the simplest patrols feel like a journey into the unknown. Young and far from home, they faced an enemy who could strike anywhere: villages, jungles, even rice paddies. The Viet Cong blended in with the local population, making it nearly impossible to know who was friend or foe. Soldiers often felt isolated, missing their families and struggling to adapt to the harsh climate and relentless tension. Guerrilla tactics and booby traps made every step dangerous. The line between friend and foe was blurred. Every path could hide a deadly trap, and every shadow might conceal an ambush. The psychological toll was immense, as fear and suspicion became part of daily life. Civilians suffered immensely, caught between two ruthless sides. Families were uprooted, homes destroyed, and lives forever changed. Many Vietnamese lived in constant fear, unsure which side would bring danger next. U.S. search and destroy missions often devastated villages, while chemical defoliants like Agent Orange poisoned land and people. The environment was scarred, crops withered, and generations would feel the effects of these toxic chemicals. The air war brought unprecedented destruction, with bombs and napalm scarring the countryside. Entire regions were left unrecognizable, and the relentless bombing campaigns left deep wounds on both the land and its people. Atrocities occurred on all sides, the most infamous being the My Lai massacre, where American troops killed hundreds of unarmed civilians. The horror of such events shocked the world and left lasting trauma for survivors. The horror was captured by journalists, bringing the war's brutality into American living rooms. Graphic images and reports fueled anti-war protests and changed public perception back home, making Vietnam the first truly televised war. Amidst chaos, moments of humanity and sacrifice shone through, but the war's moral cost was undeniable. Acts of kindness and bravery offered brief hope, yet the overwhelming suffering could not be ignored. Vietnam's landscape and people bore the scars of a conflict with no safe haven. The legacy of the war would haunt generations, a stark reminder of the true cost of conflict. As the war dragged on, America became a nation divided. The draft sent thousands to fight, disproportionately affecting the working class and minorities, fueling resentment. The anti-war movement exploded. Students, veterans, and citizens protested, demanding an end to the conflict. Protests grew larger and more confrontational, with iconic chants and draft card burnings. The war split families and generations, deepening the national divide. Unfiltered media coverage brought the war's horrors into every home, shaping public opinion. For some, the images justified the fight. For others, they exposed its futility. The turmoil peaked in 1968 with assassinations and violent clashes at the Democratic National Convention. America seemed on the brink, torn apart by a war abroad and a battle for its soul at home. The Vietnam War was no longer just a foreign conflict, it was a crisis within America itself. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive shattered illusions of progress. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam, even striking the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive failed for the communists, but psychologically, it was devastating for America. The scale of the attacks contradicted official claims of imminent victory. Media coverage, especially Walter Cronkite's skepticism, turned public opinion sharply against the war. Shocking images, street fighting in Hue, executions in Saigon, eroded trust in government. President Johnson's approval plummeted. He announced he would not seek re-election and halted bombing in the north. The Tet Offensive didn't defeat the U.S. military, but it broke the political will to escalate. It marked the beginning of America's withdrawal from Vietnam. The war's end was now a matter of when, not if. After the Tet Offensive, America's objective shifted dramatically, from seeking victory to finding a way out of the conflict. The war had become increasingly unpopular at home, and leaders faced mounting pressure to bring U.S. troops back. President Nixon introduced the Vietnamization Plan, aiming to gradually withdraw American forces while strengthening South Vietnam's military. The hope was that South Vietnamese troops could eventually defend their country on their own, allowing the U.S. to step back from direct combat. Yet, as U.S. troops pulled back, the war expanded into neighboring Cambodia and Laos through secret bombings. These actions fueled outrage across America, igniting massive anti-war protests and culminating in tragic events like the Kent State shootings. Meanwhile, peace talks in Paris dragged on for years, with negotiators from both sides locked in bitter debate. Neither the US nor North Vietnam was willing to make major concessions, prolonging the conflict and deepening the sense of stalemate. As American forces steadily withdrew, South Vietnam was left to face the North's relentless attacks. Despite receiving billions in US military aid and equipment, the South Vietnamese army struggled to hold its ground. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed, officially ending direct US involvement in the war. However, the agreement allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in the south, setting the stage for further conflict. The ceasefire proved fragile and short-lived. Without continued American support, South Vietnam's government and military quickly began to unravel, unable to withstand the renewed North Vietnamese offensive. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnam launched a massive final assault. South Vietnamese defenses collapsed rapidly, leading to chaos and panic as refugees fled advancing troops. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of Saigon's presidential palace, marking the official fall of the city and the end of the war. The chaotic evacuation of Americans and South Vietnamese allies from rooftops and the U.S. Embassy became an enduring symbol of defeat and desperation, broadcast around the world. The Vietnam War was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The scars of conflict would shape Vietnam and the United States for generations, leaving behind a legacy of loss, trauma, and unanswered questions. The war's end brought neither peace nor healing. Vietnam was devastated, millions dead, land poisoned, and families torn apart. The victorious communists imposed harsh rule. Many fled as refugees, risking everything to escape. For America, the war left over 58,000 dead and countless wounded, both physically and psychologically. Vietnam veterans returned to a divided nation, often facing indifference or hostility. The conflict bred cynicism and distrust of government, shaping a generation's worldview. America was forced to confront the limits of its power and the cost of intervention. The war's scars lingered in politics, culture, and foreign policy debates for decades. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial stands as a somber reminder of sacrifice and loss. The lessons of Vietnam endure, a warning about the price of misunderstanding and the enduring cost of war.